Story 1, History Professor here. As part of a leadership reading club, I was given the best-selling book Start with Why by Simon Sinek. Almost every historical statement made by Sinek is plainly false. The Wright brothers did not succeed because they had a greater passion for flying. Their breakthrough was developing a steering system that operated in 3 dimensions, and they fiercely defended their patent to keep others from flying. They even refused to teach their engine mechanic how to fly because they did not want him distracted from the work they needed him to do. The March on Washington, at which Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech, did not happen spontaneously after the organizers failed to send out any invitations. It was one of the most carefully planned protests in United States history. Colin Powell never said that he only needed 30% of the information to make a decision, and that having more than 70% leads to bad decisions. Sinek was trying to make the point that people should trust their gut and not their rational brain. Powell said he would never make a decision with less than 40% of the information and that gathering intelligence takes time. By the time you have more than 70% of the information, the opportunity has probably passed. The worst falsehood in the book is the claim that until recently, humans believed the Earth was flat, and that this belief prevented travel, trade, or exploration. Sinek asserts that human movement and migration only began once people realized they would not fall off the edge of the planet. This is an absurd claim, and it is hard to believe people ever took the book and its advice seriously. Story 2. I am still angry that my teachers taught me Rosa Parks was tired from her job and spontaneously refused to give up her seat on the bus. She was a trained and experienced activist who fully planned it as an act of civil disobedience. Story 3. This is a well-known story these days, but I think it's hilarious that Napoleon Bonaparte was not actually that short. Story 4. J. Bruce Ismay was treated unfairly. He was the president of White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, and was accused of ordering the ship to set a speed record. The comment about making a speed record either never happened or was a joke, as they were already making good time. He also tried to help load the lifeboats as much as he could, to the point where sailors told him to stop because he was getting in the way. He only boarded the second to last lifeboat, because there happened to be no one else around to take one of the final seats. There was no reason for him not to take the seat. He was deeply affected by the events for the rest of his life. He resigned as president of White Star Line the following year but stayed on the board to help pay insurance claims to survivors and victims' families. No meeting would end without him discussing payouts. He simply made the mistake of surviving and having an enemy in William Randolph Hearst. Story 5. A vomitorium was a passage in a Roman stadium or arena that served as an exit for crowds to leave quickly. It was not a place where Romans went to vomit in order to continue eating or enjoying themselves. Story 6. No one said ye in place of the in medieval England. They said the same as we do now, but it was written e with a thorn, a non-Latin letter inherited from languages in use before the Norman conquest. When the printing press was invented, was not typically included, as it does not exist in Germanic languages. So it began to be written as ye. However, spelling does not equal pronunciation, as anyone who speaks English knows very well. Story 7. If you were in the Middle Ages, science would get you burned at the stake. Story 8. Marilyn Monroe was not plus-sized. She weighed about 135 to 140 pounds at her heaviest, and clothing sizes today are very different from those in her era. My mom's wedding dress was a size 14 in the early 1970s. A size 10, I couldn't fit into it. She claims she was a size 14 her entire life, but due to vanity sizing and different cuts, she gained about 50 to 60 pounds and was able to wear the same clothing size for years. While I don't know the exact conversion, a size 14 in today's sizing would likely be an 18 or 20 back in the 1950s. Story 9. People did not bathe in the Middle Ages. Wealthy individuals owned bathtubs, which their servants filled with warm or hot water. Public bathhouses were common throughout Europe, providing warm and hot water, and most people had access to them. People also bathed in rivers, lakes, and streams. Story 10. The Germans did not simply allow the British to escape at Dunkirk. The German tanks, known as panzers, that could have pursued them were exhausted, overextended, and vulnerable to being cut off if they had continued the chase. Therefore, it was decided not to pursue the British into the sea. Additionally, there was extensive Air Force action against the evacuations to make them as difficult as possible. Story 11. The first shots of World War II between the United States of America and Japan were the attack on Pearl Harbor. Just before the attack, an old World War I destroyer, the USS Ward, was on patrol in the waters outside of Pearl Harbor. They had standing orders to fire upon any unidentified submarines in the area. They fired upon a conning tower but were unsure if it had been hit. They searched the area for signs of the submarine but found nothing. They radioed command, but command dismissed the report without confirmation of a successful hit or contact, one of many ignored signs of the impending attack. A few hours later, the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced. In 2004, a Japanese submarine was found off the coast of Hawaii just outside of Pearl Harbor, with a hole in the conning tower. Story 12. Lenin and the Bolsheviks did not overthrow the Tsar. It was Alexander Kerensky together with some aristocrats half a year before the October Revolution. Story 13. To go back a long way in time, coal is not the remains of dinosaurs. Almost all coal is the result of trees dying during the Carboniferous period, when there were no microorganisms or fungi to decompose the remains. The woody material captured carbon dioxide and, over millions of years under pressure, turned into coal. Most dinosaurs, when they die, decompose and are recycled by the ecosystem. The fossils we discover are very rare because after death, the remains need to be almost instantly covered in mud or earth to prevent decomposition. Even then, fossils are not organic remains, as the bones slowly mineralize without the possibility of being used as an energy source. Story 14. People in the Middle Ages did not think the earth was flat, nor was Galileo persecuted for claiming it was round. Columbus did not set out to prove the earth was round. We have known the earth is round since the time of the ancient Greeks. Galileo's claim, which was a confirmation of Copernicus' theory by observation, was that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Columbus underestimated the size of the earth, which is why few wanted to fund his expedition to find a western passage to Asia. The circumference of the earth was well established by the 15th century, and Columbus was somewhat misguided. If America had not existed, Columbus and his ships would likely have perished in the vast ocean between Europe and Asia. It was essentially luck that a continent was there, not genius. The undue credit given to Columbus is undeserved. Story 15. I am from Salem, Massachusetts, and the number of people who think the falsely accused were burned is astounding. Story 16. The British are coming. He would not have said that. Also, he was caught and others filled in. Story 17. NASA spent millions to develop a pen that works in space, while the Russians used pencils. While this is partly true, both countries originally used pencils and sought alternatives. The Fisher Company invested millions of their own money to design the pen for NASA and sold some to the agency. Story 18. It is disrespectful to say that Mama Cass died choking on a ham sandwich. Story 19. The consensus among the learned was that the world was flat. Most scientists and explorers of the era were fully aware that the Earth was a sphere. Scientists were accurately measuring the circumference of the Earth as early as the 2nd century BCE. Explorers believed they could reach India by going west. They just did not know there was an entire continent blocking the way. Story 20. In 1775, Boston, Massachusetts, a 23-year-old British postal worker hears that the British are invading. He gets on a horse and rides 350 miles to warn the colonists. His name was Israel Bissell. But what about Paul Revere? He rode 19 miles, from Boston to Cambridge. The only person he could have warned was some groundskeeper at Harvard. Israel Bissell rides from Boston across Massachusetts, through Rhode Island, across Connecticut, into New York, across New Jersey to Philadelphia. How come we never heard of Israel Bissell but everyone knows Paul Revere? In the 1860s, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow decided to write about Paul Revere. Prior to the Civil War, Longfellow, who considered himself a patriot and wanted to keep the country from splitting apart, decided to write a saga to inspire patriotism in everyone. He had a problem. Like a Hollywood producer, he needed a name, He figured Israel Bissell would not inspire anyone. So he ignored the man who rode over 300 miles and focused on the man who rode only 19 miles to create the legend of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I am fairly certain someday, people who watch the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood will say, no, the Manson family did not kill Sharon Tate. Story 21. The Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights, specifically the rights of states to own slaves. Without slavery, the Civil War would never have happened. Story 22. Spaniards do not have a lisp because there was a king who lisped. People around him thought it was cool, so they started lisping to please him. The fact that languages evolve differently in different places is beyond many people's comprehension. Also, it is not a lisp if it is intentional. Story 23. People take the writings of ancient authors at face value. Caligula was a mad tyrant, just like Nero. An ancient king used an incredibly cruel and expensive torture method. There very likely never was a war at sea led by a Roman emperor, a horse senator, the blazing bull, or scaphism. Story 24. People believe that everyone used to listen to what we now call classical music. That kind of music was only accessible to the well-off and privileged. There was a lot of popular music performed in the streets, pubs, and taverns that was simpler and more familiar to the common people, just like today. We do not have as much of it to reference because it typically was not written down like classical music was. Story 25. Medieval Europe was often perceived as a place where everyone lived in mud and filth. No one bathed, women were burned alive for showing any sign of intellect. There was no cultural, scientific, or technological development, and everyone wore depressing gray clothes and leathers. It was a messy time, with responses to plagues including killing those thought to be disease-conjuring witches, both male and female, or committing pogroms. However, it was not all extremes. People were still people, they bathed. My favorite piece of medieval European cultural development is satirical poetry and lyrics. From my homeland of Portugal, where satirical lyricism mocked traditional romantic courtship ballads, to groups of students and young clerics who made satirical poetry like my favorite, In Taberna Quando Sumus, a hymn about uniting in drinking and general tavern debauchery, forgetting the pains of life, regardless of sex, heritage, profession, or social class. When we are in the tavern, we do not think how we will go to dust, but we hurry to gamble, which always makes us sweat. What happens in the tavern, where money is host? You may well ask, and hear what I say. Some gamble, some drink, some behave loosely, but of those who gamble, some are stripped bare, some win their clothes here, some are dressed in sacks. Here no one fears death, but they throw the dice in the name of Bacchus. First of all it is to the wine merchant. The libertines drink, 1 for the prisoners, 3 for the living, 4 for all Christians, 5 for the faithful dead, 6 for the loose sisters, 7 for the soldiers in the wood, 8 for the errant brethren, 9 for the dispersed monks, 10 for the seamen, 11 for the squabblers, 12 for the penitent, 13 for the wayfarers, to the Pope as to the King. They all drink without restraint. The mistress drinks, the master drinks, the soldier drinks, the priest drinks, the man drinks, the woman drinks, the servant drinks with the maid, the swift man drinks, the lazy man drinks, the white man drinks, the black man drinks, the settled man drinks, the wanderer drinks, the stupid man drinks, the wise man drinks, the poor man drinks, the sick man drinks, the exile drinks, and the stranger, the boy drinks, the old man drinks, the bishop drinks, and the deacon, the sister drinks, the brother drinks, the old lady drinks, the mother drinks, that woman drinks, that man drinks, 100 drink, 1,000 drink. 600 pennies would hardly suffice if everyone drinks immoderately and immeasurably, however much they cheerfully drink. We are the ones whom everyone scolds, and thus we are destitute. May those who slander us be cursed, and may their names not be written in the book of the righteous. Io. Repeated 9 times. Story 26. Mine is very minor. The civilization that invented writing, as far as we know, and started it all is called Sumer, not Sumeria. It has always been referred to as Sumer in English due to the etymology of the word. The mistake likely comes from a few places. The suffix ia is common in civilization names, and the adjective form makes it look like that. Additionally, the name and civilization were only rediscovered in the 19th century, and many non-specialists did not have access to online resources to verify the term, leading to the incorrect use of Sumeria. Story 27. It was perfectly normal for girls to get married and start families at a very young age. It most definitely was not. There were nobles who had marriages of convenience at early ages, but they were hardly ever consummated until the bride was sexually mature, which was around 18 back then, as most girls did not start their period until they were 15 or 16. There were cases of common people molesting and marrying young girls just like there are today, but it was no more accepted than now. Story 28. Being from Boston and having actually lived briefly on Monument Avenue, the Battle of Bunker Hill was not fought on Bunker Hill but on Breed's Hill in Charlestown. Story 29. Those middle-aged villages were all monochromatic and dirty. Story 30. The Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans did not have the wheel. This does not really annoy me, I will admit, but they have found toys from these cultures that have wheels. Wheels are just not very good in the mountains. One slip and there goes your cart. It is better to strap it to a llama. Story 31. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Yes, you can. This line is from a terrible Supreme Court opinion that was later overturned. The point was that handing out socialist literature was akin to yelling fire and was thus not protected speech. This is a terrible ruling and was, again, overturned. Story 32. I get annoyed when college classmates from the South claim that the Civil War was not about slavery. In reality, the majority of the Confederate States explicitly declared slavery as the reason for their secession. The Declaration of the Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina explicitly cites abolition and the loss of slave property rights as their justification for secession. Story 33. The idea that fascist governments were highly organized and efficient could not be further from the truth. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Francisco Franco all created massive bureaucracies with many overlapping spheres of authority run by paranoid sociopaths. It was absolutely inefficient and chaotic madness. Story 34. Mussolini made the trains run on time. This has been thoroughly debunked. It was a propaganda slogan, not a statement of fact. Story 35. Rosa Parks did not refuse to sit in the black section of the bus. She was already sitting there when they tried to move the black section further back to make room for a white passenger. That is when she refused to move. Story 36. Women had no rights in earlier times. The historical rights of women varied widely across cultures and periods, ranging from forms of slavery to matriarchies. Story 37. It has never been common for adults to marry children. It has never been common for children to become pregnant. The average age of menarche throughout most of human history has been between 14 and 16. The chances of both mother and infant surviving increase significantly if the mother is at least 18, and improve further when she is 20. The average age of the mother at first birth throughout all of human history has been 23. Most people in the past found pedophilia as repugnant as we do today. Many people also viewed relationships between young people and much older men as either somewhat sinister or worthy of mockery. This has been a common theme in comedic stories around the world throughout human history. Story 38. The pyramids were built by skilled workers, not slaves or aliens. President Ronald Reagan secured the release of hostages in Iran. Story 39. People had healthier teeth before the widespread use of sugar. People forget that although there was less sugar in foods, dental hygiene was quite limited. Dental disease has possibly caused more deaths throughout history than any other single factor. Story 40. The American Revolution was against the government of King George III. The United Kingdom was a parliamentary democracy then, similar to how it is now. The Americans were rebelling against the governments of 4 prime ministers, from George Grenville to Charles Watson Wentworth. Story 41. Genghis Khan was a mass rapist who fathered hundreds of children. The claim that everyone in Asia is descended from him has been debunked. They are related to him but almost certainly not descendants. He literally banned rape in the Mongol Empire as part of his reforms and had only 9 recorded children, mainly with his first beloved wife. Even then, one of them was probably an illegitimate child. Story 42. The life expectancy was low, so everyone died young. That is not how life expectancy works. It varies depending on many variables, including how old you are at the moment. Infant and child mortality was very high before the 20th century. Depending on where and when we are talking about, fully half of all babies born could expect to die before their 5th birthday. A child who survived past the age of 5 still had a good chance of dying before the age of 10. Infant and child mortality lowers the average life expectancy significantly. However, a basic human being was not inherently more likely to die young. If you survived preventable childhood illness and malnutrition, your life expectancy looked much more like it does today. If you managed to live to middle age, surviving plagues, warfare, death in childbirth, and rampant interpersonal violence, you were as likely to live to 100 as you are today. Story 43. Maybe the one that bothers me is the mischaracterization of the reaction of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas to the first arrival of Europeans. In general, the white men were not thought of as gods, since they obviously had all the baser aspects of humanity on display. Instead, they seemed to be a contradiction enormously. Ignorant of basic survival skills, yet possessed of fantastic technology. The native tribes then had a decision to make. Either ally with the newcomers and use their technology to become the dominant power in the area and take over their rivals, or push the interlopers back into the sea and hope they would keep away. In North America, the decision was influenced by the fact that the leaders of the tribes likely had more information on the Europeans than the colonists had on them. Hence, the powerful Powhatan Confederacy played a more cautious game, as they knew what had happened with the Spanish to the south, while the various tribes in the New England area, weakened by epidemics and politically fractured, created alliances that lasted until King Philip's War. Story 44. 1. Napoleon was not short. He was actually of average height for his time. The myth was British propaganda. 2. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Those are opera costumes, not historical fact. 3. Medieval peasants did bathe. They had bathhouses and bathed more frequently than Victorians. 4. Educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. The idea that they thought it was flat is false. 5. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." That phrase was written decades earlier about a different person. Story 45. This is probably well known, but I still hear people confuse the 3/5 compromise, thinking that it was slavery supporters who made the rule that slaves were 3/5 of a person. Southerners wanted slaves to be counted as much as possible because it would boost Southern votes and representation for their masters, while the slaves themselves obviously could not vote. Story 46. I don't know if I could call this an inaccuracy, but there is a persistent idea that Ty Cobb was a racist simply because he was from Georgia in the late 19th and early 20th century. People believe that he did not like black people simply because he was from Georgia, but he came from a prominent family that opposed slavery. I do not know what Cobb's views on the civil rights movement were, but he publicly defended Jackie Robinson as Robinson became the first black man to play in Major League Baseball. Cobb, at the very least, publicly advocated for the integration of baseball on the grounds that the best players should be allowed to compete in the same league, regardless of race. Story 47. Before 1492, many people believed the world was flat. However, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the earth was known to be spherical. The first thing seen as a ship approached shore was the top of the mast, and the lookout was positioned there. They understood that the sea was level and that it curved at the same time. Experts warned Christopher Columbus that his plan to sail to India was flawed. He underestimated the Earth's size and believed he could reach India with the provisions on his ships. The presence of a continent in his path saved his life and the lives of his crew. Story 48. The Vietnam War was primarily between North Vietnam and the United States of America. Many overlook South Vietnam, despite the fact that the vast majority of military deaths on the anti-communist side were from the South Vietnamese military. Story 49. The United States was founded as a Christian nation, And all of the founding fathers were Christians. I am very tired of hearing this and having to explain it to people who then ignore what I say and still believe whatever nonsense they wish because it suits their theocratic agenda. Story 50. Medieval people did drink water. Yes, it is true that beer and ale were good alternatives when there was not a safe source of water. They also provided calories. However, that does not mean people stopped drinking water for several centuries. People still need water to survive. Story 51. Well over half of what you know about Vikings is not true. They were not barbarians who raped and had no respect for women. Women could actually choose to be warriors if they wanted, and at home the wife was the boss. They did not just plunder and steal. They were great farmers and traders. Most Vikings traveled for trade, not to steal anything. They were not lawless. They actually had a system for enforcing law and order called a ting, where people could bring their complaints and have their arguments heard. They were judged by their kings and neighbors. They never wore those idiotic horned helmets. Story 52. Everyone thinks armors disappeared right after European armies adopted firearms, while plate suits were still worn on battlefields well into the 17th century. Story 53. The persistent inaccuracy of medieval to Renaissance-era European weapons and armor in all forms of media. I do not mind fantastical designs as long as they are practical. The designs almost never are. Story 54. Mixing up slings and slingshots. Slings, like from the story of David and Goliath, are a rope or cord with a leather pouch in the middle to hold the stone. It is whirled around to build power, then one end is released to launch. They are ancient weapons and deadly in the hands of a skilled hunter. Slingshots are modern devices, invented after the creation of vulcanized rubber in 1839 by Charles Goodyear. Story 55. The Treaty of Versailles was too harsh. The penalties France suffered after the Napoleonic Wars were much harsher, for example. It was a fairly standard approach and was used as fuel for Hitler to start the Second World War, so it is true it helped cause it. However, it was not too harsh for the times. Besides, Germany basically ignored a lot of it anyway. Story 56. Corsets were painful and restrictive. Corsets, stays, and bodies were support garments. For much of their history, they were constructed using whalebone, flexible reeds, cording, as well as shaped panels of fabric to provide structure, shaping, and to help support the weight of the outer layers of clothing. They went through many iterations in style depending on location and era. While some look extreme from our viewpoint, they probably thought the same about our modern-day shapewear. Many of the extreme proportions were achieved by adding layers of petticoats or padding to other areas of the body, not by squishing the waist down. That is not to say some people did not tight lace or go to various lengths for the sake of vanity, but it was not necessarily the norm. Story 57. That the indigenous peoples in the Americas were all Stone Age savages. Story 58. Prescott Bush was part of the business plot. He actually had nothing to do with it, and there was never any mention or hint that he was involved. The idea that he was involved started in the early 2000s by internet conspiracy theorists. He was involved with the Harriman Clearinghouse that handled Nazi money for a while, which is not the same as regular banking. If the Nazis bought something in the United States, the clearinghouse would hold the money and wait for the checks to clear. When they did, they allowed the money to move. That is all it was. When the war started, all that money waiting to be processed was seized. Conspiracy theorists make it seem like they were profiting off the war or helping the Nazis launder money. In reality, it was not anything unusual. Harriman never got into trouble, was a close advisor to Franklin D. Roosevelt, and even joined the National Recovery Administration. He eventually became a prominent advisor to multiple Democratic presidents and even ran for president as well. Story 59. The line from Jaws is, "You're gonna need a bigger boat." Not we. Story 60. People in the Middle Ages only drank beer or wine and avoided drinking water because they believed it was unsafe, or that they would mix alcohol into their water. This is not true at all. Story 61. The surface talk about Easter Island that comes up whenever a Moai picture is posted is unsubstantiated. Not all of them are as large as that one picture of a massive statue being excavated. There are over 800 all over the island in various states, positions, shapes, and sizes still today. There is no definitive explanation of what happened there, such as deforestation or tribal conflicts. There are researched hypotheses, but nothing conclusive. It is a complex place like any other, and the descendants still live there. Story 62. Canada's war crimes are the reason for the Geneva Convention. Story 63. The America that we know was founded by the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. This was emphasized in our elementary school education. The Spanish had mission-based settlements in several modern United States, such as St. Augustine, Florida, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, among others long before Plymouth Rock. However, as the saying goes, the winners write the history books, with England being the victor at the time. It is interesting to consider how this history might have been taught in United States schools if Spain had prevailed against England during their conflicts in that period. Story 64. Americans did not single-handedly win World War II. Granted, it is mainly Americans who think that, but it is still annoying to hear. Story 65. European swords were heavy and dull, and no one knew how to wield them until they reached the East. Story 66. Native Americans of the Mesoamerican and Andean areas did not have knowledge about civilization as defined by other cultures. You should research how they lived and developed their societies. Story 67. The year 2000 bug turned out to be nothing to worry about. This was because millions of programmers spent a long time fixing it before it caused any problems. Story 68. Conservative relationships. They believe that the period from 1900 to 1950 is the historical norm. The norm was that if you were not rich, both you and your spouse worked, and your children worked with you. They also tend to ignore many of the problematic aspects of traditionalism and customary expectations. Story 69. That everyone smelled bad. I'm sure some people smelled bad just like some people do today, but people kept clean in other ways. You don't have to take a bath or shower every single day to avoid smelling bad. People weren't idiots back then. They knew how to keep themselves clean and smelling okay. Story 70. Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus were farther apart than Tyrannosaurus and humanity, but any dinosaur project invariably depicts them coexisting. Story 71. Pit bulls used to be called nanny dogs. Parents would leave their children alone with pit bulls while working. How can anyone actually believe that? Story 72. The iPhone was not a unique revolutionary product. It was not anything special. When it first appeared, the specifications fell well short of the competition. Could not record video and did not even have third-generation cellular network technology. Sony Ericsson, LG, Nokia, Samsung, and many others had already been offering both for years. It was essentially just a low-grade personal digital assistant with a cellular modem included. The only thing that made it stand out was a fantastic marketing campaign. The marketing campaign changed the general direction of the smartphone market, but the idea that it was some amazing futuristic device is revisionist history. Story 73. Confederate statues are meant to preserve history. I'm sure it has been discussed plenty online, but this annoys me personally since I still see many people in my daily life who use this as part of an argument to justify flying Confederate flags or admiring Confederate leaders. We don't need statues to preserve history. We have books and museums for that. They were built to rewrite history. Make the Civil War's losers look like heroes, celebrate those losers, and intimidate black people. If you think of Confederate symbols as part of your heritage, why are black people not part of that community? They live in the same states as you, eat similar cuisine, and are your literal neighbors. Are you really more willing to side with slave owners than the people you live with? Story 74. There are no contemporary records of Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. None of the surviving complete biographies of them are from that era, but original first-hand accounts still exist. For example, in temples in Egypt, and on contemporary coins bearing their names and faces. Story 75. Not sure if it counts as historical inaccuracy, but it annoys me that we keep being told that Jesus was born on December 25th. Everyone knows the date was borrowed from pagan festivals, yet it is still repeated as gospel truth. Story 76. Nobody was burned as a witch during the Salem witch trials. Mostly they were hanged, which, was also barbaric. But we did not burn anyone in the United States for witchcraft, to the best of my knowledge. Story 77. People absolutely bathed regularly. It's just that they didn't have the water resources to immerse their bodies in water or continuously flow water over themselves. They were, however, washing themselves daily with a washcloth, soap, and wash basin. They also relied on their clothing to absorb sweat and oils while keeping dirt off their bodies. They changed their underclothes frequently, probably more than we do today. Combined with the fact that they wore natural fibers and had a diet low in refined sugar, they probably didn't smell like much of anything. Story 78. The Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights to own slaves. So yes and no. It was definitely fought over the dispute about slavery. Story 79. In the Middle Ages, everyone was deeply religious and did not bathe regularly. Story 80. People in the Middle Ages did not bathe regularly. Having an actual bath, such as a large tub of hot water, was very rare at certain times and places, but people would often perform sponge baths. Story 81. The Wright brothers were the first to fly heavier-than-air-powered aircraft. However, people were flying in balloons throughout the entire 19th century. Story 82. Businessmen jumping out of skyscrapers on Black Tuesday. Significant numbers of people taking the War of the Worlds broadcast seriously. Hiroshima and Nagasaki being bombed over a mistranslated word. That would have had to happen twice. Jews, Roma, Poles, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, the disabled, outspoken German citizens, and prisoners of war all committed to the same epic hoax to slander Hitler and oppress the Aryan race. Their descendants apparently continue the hoax. Christopher Columbus was Jewish and served Queen Isabella, who expelled the Jews from Spain and brought her native captives to convert to Christianity. Medieval armor was incredibly heavy. The knights had to move quickly and fight in that armor. Story 83. For me, it is not about what is said. It is about what is not said. Northern English working-class history is not well represented at all. Many of our employment rights were fought for by trade unionists in places like Bradford, Manchester, and Halifax. The Chartist movement also started in the North. Much of the infrastructure in England was funded by industries in the North and Midlands, all powered by coal mined from Durham, Newcastle, South Yorkshire, and Wales. I am sure Scotland, Wales, and the Channel Islands also have something to say about how their history is often overlooked. London is not the sum total of the British Isles or the United Kingdom. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.